Thank you very much. Um, on behalf of the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean, Cerlac, and the organizing committee of the Baptista Lecture, I would like to extend each one of you and our main speaker, Professor uh, Tewarie. I'm very sure I'm going to mispronounce your name, Bhoendradatt, Bhoendradatt, Tewarie, and Professor Diego Sanchez and Cochea, that's easier for me. Welcome to our campus. My name is Miguel Gonzalez, and I am a research fellow at Cerlac and faculty in the Department of Social Science at York University. I'm also the chair of the organizing committee of the Baptista Lecture this year. Since 1978, Cerlac has been a vibrant hub for community-engaged research, collaborative scholarship, and academic excellence. Cerlac has pursued a socially progressive scholarship in collaboration with partners throughout the Americas and close at home. The Michael Baptista Lecture is the annual public event of Cerlac. It was established by friends and family of Michael Baptista and the Royal Bank of Canada to recognize areas central to his remarkable spirit and success, the importance of his Guyanese and Caribbean roots, his dedication and outstanding achievements, and his unconditional drive and love for learning. This year, the Baptista Lecture features as the inaugural event of the annual Congress of the Canadian Association of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, CALACS. On behalf of Cerlac and the Baptista Committee, we welcome everyone to our campus and this inaugural lecture. Now I would like to invite Luisa to the stage. Luisa Isidro Herrera, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology and also a research associate with Cerlac, to read a land acknowledgement.
Hello everyone, can you hear me well? This land acknowledgement seeks to reflect on the broad, public and co-created document by York University and Indigenous Nations in Sacramento, what is known now as Toronto. More than a formal statement, it is an invitation to engage with the deeper meaning of land and its acknowledgement, particularly in relation to the theme of this event and the broader political process unfolding globally. Human knowledge systems and languages, especially those rooted in indigenous knowledge systems, are inseparable from the land. Land is not a mere product of human labor or an object of possession. Rather, it is a vital, living medium necessary for the creation of sustenance of both human and non-human life. It connects to us, to our identity, speaks to us, and in doing so, affirms our intrinsic right to the return. The greatest attack on knowledge system on indigenous and non-indigenous human knowledge alike is land dispossession. For many of us in the audience, the word settler fails to capture the weight of the previous and current dispossession. Therefore, it is important to recognize that the land many of us now call home, including diaspora communities from Latin America and the Caribbean, has been shared, cared for, and defended by many before us. In the case of indigenous nations of this land, from which I speak, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, has been over 12,000 years. Land acknowledgements must go beyond words. They are acts of commitment, reflection, and action. As Anishinaabe scholar Liam Simpson reminds us, land is woven, web of relationships through which learning takes place. To practice land as pedagogy to truly learn in community requires resisting the imposition of settler colonial authority, surveillance, and violence. I encourage to use these academic spaces as sites of commitment, reflection, and action to critically engage with what land means to you and to all of those who have come before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. And now, allow me to introduce you to now the president of CALACS, Professor Laura McDonald, who will welcome you to the Congress.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here today and to welcome all of you to this wonderful space at York and to this wonderful Baptista lecture event. On behalf of CALACS, I want to say that we're really thrilled that Cerlac was able to host our annual Congress here today, and they were so kind as to join together with us in sharing this Baptista lecture space. I really want to welcome all the participants, and especially Dr. Tewarie, who's going to give us a very fascinating talk, I'm sure, and my good friend Diego Sanchez Ancochea from Oxford, who's going to give some remarks. I also wanted to talk just a little bit about the long relationship CALACS and Cerlac have established over the years. I was trying to do a little bit of historical research before I came on the train, in fact. So it seems that both CALACS and Cerlac were basically formed around the same time, possibly in the same year. Our journal, the CALACS Journal, which was originally titled North-South Canadian Journal of Latin American Studies, which then was changed to Canadian Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the first issue was published in 1976. So it's just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Both were the product of early interest among Canadian academics in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think before this point, as scholars of the Latin American-Canadian relationship know, there was little mutual interest between the two regions, especially Latin America and Canada. We had a longer history, not a happy one in many respects, a somewhat exploitative relationship with the Caribbean, but relations with Latin America were limited. So it was in this moment when both Cerlac and CALACS were born, and we have grown, matured, and diversified in response to challenges in the region, as well as changes in intellectual orientations in Canada. And even if other universities have developed expertise over the years on Latin America and the Caribbean as a region, Latin American and Caribbean studies in Canada is almost unthinkable without Cerlac. Both of us face challenges because of the fact that intellectual interest in area studies in general has fallen from favor, especially in my discipline, political science. The turn towards quantitative methods has kind of led to the rejection of area studies as parochial, descriptive, failing to contribute to reliable generalization or theory development. And in my discipline as well, students are often attracted more to international relations rather than area studies. But I think CALACS and Cerlac have shown the benefits of gaining deep understanding of the local, the particular, and sensitive development of knowledge rooted in deep understanding of specific contexts, while also recognizing the way in which the local is linked to the global. And both Cerlac and CALACS, I think, are deeply committed to the idea of engaged scholarship, that scholarship is not just about knowing more facts or developing abstract theories, but committing ourselves to working together for improving our regions that we study. As an association, CALACS is deeply indebted to Cerlac. Part of this relationship is personal. Many of us active in Latin American and Caribbean studies in Canada, including myself, were trained at York and had close ties to Cerlac as an institution, as well as to specific individuals. I'm looking at Lisa North here, who devoted their lives to passing along their knowledge and mentoring younger scholars. I'm a proud York and Cerlac graduate, and some of my best friends were made here at Cerlac on the York campus, and many formative experiences, both personal and academic, happened to me here. And this is true not just of me, but many people involved in CALACS and in Latin American studies in Canada. As a recognition of the importance Cerlac has in our association this year, we have chosen to honor a former Cerlac director and longtime Cerlac collaborator, Alan Simmons, with our Distinguished Scholar Award. And there'll be a panel on Saturday honoring Alan's work, who I also studied with here at York, and it will be followed by lunch. Alan has contributed enormously to the study of migration and Canada, Caribbean, Latin American ties through the diaspora. Beyond this, Cerlac has generously provided critical institutional support. It has several times hosted CALACS congresses, and in recent years, CALACS is actually physically based here in the Cerlac offices. So Cerlac has generously provided office space. And our wonderful staff person, who you just heard from, Luisa, who read the land acknowledgement, is based there. Camila Bonifaz, ¿dónde estás, Camila? Also has been incredibly supportive over the years, both to Luisa specifically and to CALACS and to me personally, I would say. So we really appreciate all this mutual support. As I said, we're sort of born together, grew up together, we're kind of enlaced together, rooted together in relationships of intellectual interest, but also personal affection and support. So we're also, Cerlac has helped us migrate our website to the York server in the last year, which has been incredibly helpful as well. And another really important thing that Cerlac is contributing to us is a greater emphasis on the role of the Caribbean in the Americas, an aspect that often gets overlooked in Latin American Studies associations. So CALACS, Cerlac is setting a high bar, and we hope to continue to live up to better integrating the study of the Caribbean and looking at Caribbean Latin American ties as well as Caribbean Latin America's Canadian ties. So finally, I just really want to thank Tamika and Maria Constance, the co-directors of Cerlac, on behalf of CALACS, for their amazing support for this year's Congress. We look forward to working with Cerlac for the next 50 years. Well, I might not be here, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Just for you to know, there's going to be a reception follow the Baptista lecture. And now I just wanted to mention that Professor Tewarie has a special guest in the room today. That is Professor Radha Prasad, and he's grad student from Glendon campus, which is a York University campus with a French content. Do you mind standing up so we know who you are, where you are? Thank you very much. Thanks. And now I'm going to call to the main stage Professor Tamika Jones, co-director of Cerlac. And she's going to be introducing our main speaker and the discussant.
Thank you, Miguel. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tamika Samuels-Jones, assistant professor here at York and co-director of Cerlac. I'm joined by fellow co-director Maria Constanza Guzman, and I have the privilege this evening of welcoming our keynote speaker, Tewarie. Tewarie is a distinguished fellow at the Trade and Economic Development Unit at the University of the West Indies, Trinidad and Tobago. So that's our St. Augustine campus, and where he has served for 30 years as a teacher, researcher, and administrator. Dr. Tewarie has had a full career as a politician, parliamentarian, senator, MP, and cabinet minister. He served as leader of government of business in the House of Representatives, executive director of the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business, principal of the Trinidad and Tobago campus of the University of the West Indies, and pro-vice chancellor for planning and development of the university. Dr. Tewarie has been a true innovator in education. He founded the Institute of Critical Thinking at the UWI And while serving as chair of the National Institute of Higher Education Research, Science and Technology, he facilitated the creation of the College of Science, Technology and Applied Arts and the National Science Center. He also conceptualized the National Training Agency, focused on vocational skills and the framework for the Dollar for Dollar program and the government-assisted tertiary education program, which dramatically increased the participation rate for tertiary education in the country. Dr. Tewarie has published widely on education and economic and sustainable development issues related to the Caribbean. He has published 6 books and another is due for publication in July 2025. His latest book was published 2 weeks ago and is entitled China in the Caribbean, Trade, Investment and Geopolitical Influence. And this is my shameless plug, it's very good, it's on Amazon. He is a board member of the oldest football club in Trinidad and Tobago, of which his son is chair. And he's a lover of music and sports. I did ask Dr. Tewarie to share some personal information with me because I think as academics, sometimes the human aspect of us is lost. He also said that he's very proud of his wife, Kamla, who is a retired high school teacher in French and Spanish and a graduate of the University of Toronto. He's also proud of his son, Nirad, who is CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in Trinidad and Tobago, and his daughter, Shanta, a law professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and he loves his 5 grandchildren. Please join me in welcoming this evening's keynote speaker, Dr. Tewarie.
Okay, so now sit down. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for that very, very kind introduction. I am more than happy to be here to deliver this talk under the banner of Michael Baptista and Cerlac at this CALACS Congress. And I have taken the liberty to alter the title a little bit. I'm going to focus a little bit on the Caribbean, a little bit more on the Caribbean, and the collective will to self-sustainability in the geopolitics of the Western Hemisphere. Because Caribbean and Latin America, yes, have been kind of dissonantly separate in disposition towards each other and towards the world. But I think that we are seeing a shift which I would like to recognize here this evening, and I hope I'll be able to illustrate. And I think as well that what Professor McDonald spoke about in terms of the kind of work that has been done by CALACS and Cerlac really is a tribute to what you might call a kind of collaborative desire becoming manifest, and also a significant intellectual entrepreneurship that makes it happen. And I want to commend CALACS as well for the theme that has been chosen here today, and I couldn't go any further without thanking Professor Tamika Jones, the co-chair of Cerlac, and her entire board, and I would have to include in that the board of CALACS, I suppose, because everybody would have known, and you have graciously invited me here. You've made this possible. And I want to acknowledge Michael Baptista, a Guyanese who did so much for the discipline, and with such sensitivity and care and concern for the people who live in this region, but who also was a man of many parts, who reached out beyond academia, as you saw in his life, and that is something I admire, because I think that if you live your life and you do research, you do work, you write, you talk about things, then you should also do more than what you think about. And I really value that, and that makes it really great to be here under the auspices of so many wonderful, high-achieving, caring people about the discipline that they are involved in and about the people they represent in the research work that they do. Now, if we look at the maps there, you'd see really you're talking about the Arctic Circle to the southern tip of South America. You're talking about 48 countries in the Western Hemisphere, 35 of them are in the OAS. Canada is the largest country. Sometimes people forget that. But it is the largest country in the hemisphere and the second largest in the world. The USA, of course, is the dominant power economically, politically, technologically, militarily, and geopolitically. And it is driven by the Monroe Doctrine of 1863. And there are two important principles in that, and that we are going to see recur over and over again, which is you can't have chaotic countries in the hemisphere. If you have chaos in a country, it's going to spread like a disease, and therefore it must be snuffed out and dealt with. And the second thing is that you cannot have outside powers coming into the hemisphere and interfering. And that, for a long time, was about Europe and the continuation of the European order. But that has all changed now. And Europe is not the problem anymore. The problem is elsewhere, as we will see here. And that has meant that dissonance might well be called the characteristic of Western Hemisphere life and the engagement of countries in the hemisphere. So that, for instance, Cuba is a problem for the United States and for many countries since 1959. Venezuela is a big problem today. Nicaragua has been a problem for some time. And there are two more. Bolivia is a problem. Ecuador is a problem. So when you have a situation in which an entire hemisphere of countries are not guided by any collective philosophical frame, and you have this kind of dissonance in which some countries find it very hard to fit in or find it hard to be seen as fitting in, it can be a big problem. So we look at the map though, and we see not only the Western Hemisphere in relation to the world, but we see the Caribbean and Latin America. We really see how close they are and how connected they are. And really, they are swimming in the basin of the Caribbean Sea, all of them. They are all washed by the Caribbean Sea. All their shores are washed by the Caribbean Sea. They're located between North and South America. Some of them are island nations. You have mainland nations. Some are in South America, some in Central America. You have dependencies of European countries still not independent. You have Latin America, but you also have South America and Central America. And there are similarities, but also differences and very unique qualities. And then in the middle of all of that, you have CARICOM, which is the oldest surviving integration movement in the developing world. I'm sure that a lot of people don't recognize that, but that's a fact. It is the oldest surviving integration movement in the developing world. It has 15 member states and 5 associate member states. Now, I want to congratulate CALACS on the choice of theme. I mean, that when I heard the theme, I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. Because the whole of the Western Hemisphere, when you look at the history, is about junctures and disjunctures. The founding of new societies by Louis Hart, written I think around 1964, so there have been other publications, republication of the book, talked about the founding of new societies. What is a greater example of a juncture than the founding of new societies? Naipaul talks about the mingling of peoples and the easy movement of people. I want to emphasize the easy movement for one issue I want to raise, which is immigration, which I will deal with later. You know, the big issue in immigration today is that the United States has really locked out the rest of the hemisphere and the world from moving into the United States. Okay, so immigration has been an issue treated like that. But the entire founding of new societies in the Americas and the mingling of peoples that came with it and the easy movement of people was part of a pattern and ethos of development in the Western Hemisphere. And that has since been disrupted over time, and we need to think about it rather than think of it in the hardened terms in which it is presented today. Now, with the founding of new societies, you had settled cultures. The first peoples were always here. The European came with empire. You had Africans enslaved and brought here to work. And actually, they established the 3 major culture spheres, according to Hart's: the Amerindian, the European, and the African. And then especially in the 19th century, you have a vast migration of people from all over the world, all over the Americas. And these became part of what you might call marginal cultures to the settled cultures. And with that, of course, and the easy movement, you have multi-ethnic societies, cultural diversity, national pride, regional solidarity, and easy movement. What I'm trying to capture here is the extent to which the Americas, and especially Latin America, and the Caribbean too, evolved with a certain kind of ethos about engagement of people with each other. Because these things could have hardened and turned into conflict, but it did not. It really however imperfect the societies, the settled cultures, the marginal cultures were able to coexist and live together. Now there are nationalisms too. The US can be very nationalistic. Canada has a strong sense of itself. Brazil, very nationalist country. Argentina, extremely nationalistic. And there's also a regional sense. Simon Bolivar, his view was not just of a Latin America, but a Latin America sort of embracing a kind of world vision for Latin America. And you have from the Caribbean someone like George Padmore, who saw the Caribbean not only as integrated and self-sufficient, independent, but that carried over to all the colonized countries of Africa, and he made his influence there. So the vision of a regional sense, both for the Caribbean and Latin America, remained. But there was also an American sense of hemisphere value, and that was driven by the Monroe Doctrine philosophy, which is that no chaos in a country and no interference from the outside. And it persists. This Summit of the Americas took place a few years ago. It will take place again soon. And that was very problematic. 3 countries were left out. Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela were left out. So it was a Summit of the Americas -3. And what happened then was about 7 or 8 heads of government decided they wouldn't come either. And they sent lower level delegations. And the OAS, the Organization of American States, which is supposed to really be a kind of governance council for the Americas, is a place up to now of intense conflict and difficulties in finding consensus on most issues. Now, there were many disjunctures also. All right, we went through this. The imperial encounter with the First Peoples is nothing but genocidal. If you know the history of a country like Dominican Republic, which is both Latin American and Caribbean, every single Amerindian in that country was wiped out. Every single last one during the colonial period. The slave trade and the brutal rupture of enslavement was nothing but savagery. The challenge to the colonial order and the release of revolutionary zeal was really a rebellion against subjugation. And Simon Bolivar led that philosophically, ideologically. And outside migration and the inevitable interethnic and cultural tensions did not turn out to be all negative, because out of that came the fantastic multi-ethnic literatures of the Western Hemisphere. Whether you go to Canada, where you have a French and an English literature coming out of Canada, and then the multi-ethnicity which follows that in Canada, or you go into the United States, where you have Jewish American literature, you have Italian American literature, you have Irish American literature, you have Afro-American literature, or whether you go down all the way down south. In every country, you have what might be called the mainstream literature, as well as the literature coming out of marginal cultures that make the literature richer. And that has happened everywhere, including the West Indies. You could not have a writer like V.S. Naipaul or Sam Selvon in the Caribbean were it not for this multi-ethnic clash. So the post-World War II period, you're really talking about the dominance of the USA as a big, strong power. You have things like trade, investment, migration, development, ideology on the one hand, poverty, inequality, ethnic tensions, political and ideological conflicts, international alliances, democracy, authoritarianism, militarization, social fragmentation, division, violent politics, all of these things converge in what has evolved as the society of the Americas. So you started as the founding of new societies, but you have evolved to a situation of not just a limited dissonance, but a kind of dissonance that has become pervasive now in the Americas, whether you go north or you go south. And you have a shift in tone, character, the structure, the geopolitical context, the guns, the drugs, the gangsterism, the shift of geopolitical power and influence, with countries actually coming in and make a difference in their presence. And then when you look at the history in terms of personalities, and I'll call a few: Christopher Columbus, Simon Bolivar, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, Manuel Noriega, Donald Trump. When you think of it like that, you can see not so many disjunctures, but you can see also a lot of dissonance as well in the Americas. And there are some wonderful books that have recently been written about these, and they worth delving into, because it's important to understand the journey. Now, the United States, of course, as the dominant power, at one time seized Puerto Rico. They were involved in Panama, the DR, they were involved in Honduras, Nicaragua, Cuba, Haiti, of course, before. And all of that, though, happened in the early part of the century, but in the post-Second World War period and then after, they were up to even recently involved in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East. Their attention was turned elsewhere, and you might even say that they didn't pay much attention to this hemisphere at all. But doing that had opened the door to chaos in individual countries. Venezuela is a good example. And to outside interference. Because in the hemisphere now, you have very locked into their mission Russia, China, Iran, you have Turkey as well, but you also have a terrorist presence that is almost hard to identify in terms of source and objectives. So, Venezuela and the Caribbean, basically, this is what you have. I won't read it. You can read it as well as I can. But I want to stress the migration crisis with immigrants spreading out throughout the world, but in the Americas and especially in the Caribbean. You also have, I was explaining to you how close they are and how there's so much in common and yet sometimes so much space between them. And what you have now is a source of worry emerging for the United States and other countries as well, which is the presence of China in the region. And I put up the Venezuela map in particular because I think the connection between China and Venezuela is something that perhaps has not been paid attention to in the way that it needs to. Now, there were 8 million people who fled Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. That's about 1/3 of the population. It is the second largest migration in the world under conditions of political and economic duress and militarization and human rights abuse. The only bigger one was in Syria under Assad. A significant number of these people migrated to the Caribbean, 10 countries in particular. And I want to make a couple points about migration, because the big point I'm making about migration is that we are locking out countries from migration now, but the movement of peoples was really quite normal in the hemisphere for a long time. This might surprise you. 86% of asylum seekers in the world, refugees and displaced people, end up in developing countries rather than developed countries. So developed countries complain a lot, but they take in 14% of displaced people in the world. Who takes them in? Other developing countries. Now, take a look at this. I won't dwell on it. You can read it and that shows the migration pattern and what happened. Venezuelan migration was the most underfunded of any set of displaced people in the world. Look at Syria and look at South Sudan. And look where they went. And it's not a large number for the Caribbean, but when you look at it in percentage terms, you realize if you have a country like Aruba, that is 100,000 or 10,000, and 17,000 people come in a country of 100,000, it is a kind of overwhelming, it's an overload, it's an overwhelming experience. Okay, so I just wanted to, but the migration also did something that was important. I won't read it, but this is what it did. It built bonds between Venezuela and the Caribbean and between Latin America and the Caribbean. Because there were people in all of these islands. They had to be accommodated, they were treated well, except for the problem of education, where English presented a difficulty of trying to get the kids in school quickly. They were properly treated. They were engaged, they were given an opportunity, and it facilitated good relations. Even in Guyana, which now has a conflict with Venezuela over oil, the people were treated properly. So one problem with Maduro did not transfer over to Venezuelan immigrants. And this is how the relations have also been building in all of these. The organizations have been building, some of them on ideological grounds like ALBA, but the others simply on the basis of solidarity. And one of the things there is that the Petro-Caribbean initiative by Hugo Chavez, in which he basically provided oil to all the non-energy producing countries of the Caribbean. The entire debt, in the case of Dominica, for instance, $100 million of debt was just wiped out. So those things cannot help but bring countries closer to one another, because they are tangible and real benefits. The geopolitics involving Venezuela and the USA, I don't need to, I passed it, a free and fair election, the authoritarian. The whole approach, I think it affected the migrant crisis. And that is why it was so underfunded. Because the politics prevented the world, and in this case the US and the UN system, although the UN system tried very hard, it prevented what you might call a humanitarian effort on the scale that was necessary. In energy, energy was also used to build friendships, but it also caused a problem because of the politics, and you can see it there. Trinidad and Tobago lost its OFAC license. Chevron's OFAC license was withdrawn because of sanctions against Venezuela. What is the point I want to make there? The history and the evolution of the natural gas deal between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, and involving three corporations, Shell, BP, and the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago, underscores the sheer power of the USA in this hemisphere, the complexity of ongoing Caribbean relations with Venezuela and Latin America, and the delicacy with which a small country which neighbors Venezuela has to navigate with the US for matters involving its own survival and sustainability. It's an important point because it is repeated in other things. You know, you have the impact of power on energy and natural gas. You have the election situation in Venezuela affecting relations with the United States, but also affecting everybody else. And it affects all the engagement with everybody. And that transfers over to Cuban doctors who come into the Caribbean to work. And the hemisphere strategy is driven by US interests. And you have a 10% tariff now imposed on the CARICOM countries. So that what is happening there is as issues come up in the hemisphere in which the United States has an interest, it then affects policy. That policy then affects the conditions of behavior of particular countries and in relation to other countries as well. And therefore there's an element of control which is important to understand. Now the Caribbean became important to to Venezuela for various reasons. Because they now have people all over the Caribbean. They were involved in the energy issues that I mentioned. All of these significant forums that I talked about in terms of CELAC and ALBA and all the others that brought countries together, the whole point of that was to bring the region together in a political way that was quite significant. Now, China, Venezuela has an interest in the Caribbean because it now has people in the Caribbean, it has a relation with the Caribbean, it has an energy relationship in the Caribbean. And more importantly, the whole of the Caribbean is becoming an energy province. You have Guyana, you have Suriname, you have Venezuela, you have Trinidad and Tobago, you have Grenada, you have Barbados, you have French Guyana. All of these countries have energy resources. So the province of energy in that part of the world is changing. China has a big interest, not just in the resources, but in the geopolitics of having 15 or 20 countries aligned with it in the Caribbean Sea alone, and an entire continent, half a continent, aligned with it in other ways. And therefore, it is very active. I don't need to read those, but you see what I'm talking about there. But I want to read the last line. 2005 to 2011, intensification of effort by both Venezuela and China to build good relations, court the Caribbean and build up hemispheric relations with China. Now the question is, were they acting in concert? That is to say, are they collaborating? Well, they might have been. Because Hugo Chavez made it his business when he established the first CELAC meeting to have the predecessor to Xi Jinping call on the phone and give a message. And it was a very important event. And that has now gone on with annual meetings every year, some of them in China. One of the meetings soon is going to take place in China. So, and China presents this as a developing country engagement. China presents itself and describes itself as the largest developing country in the world. And look at that list of things that happened between 2005 and 2011. And if there is a concerted attempt to bring the Caribbean into the Latin American orbit, and to bring the Caribbean and Latin America into the Chinese orbit, and there is a geopolitical agenda that might have, if you want, ideological considerations, you realize that we are talking about a matter of some intensity here. Now, again, Xi Jinping has put out 4 volumes of his speeches. And reading that is a revelation. I've read every one of those speeches in those 4 volumes because I was doing a book at the time. And it is a revelation to read those speeches. The clarity of it, the precision of it, the consistency of it, and the strategy of it. It is amazing. So, this is how he proceeds. He comes into power, he's secretary of the party, immediately takes charge of the military, then he takes charge of the government. And then he proceeds to expand from Asia out into the world. They were already in Africa, but out into the world, big time. And this is how he goes. He came to Trinidad. Mrs. Prasad Bisasa, who is the prime minister today after 10 years being in opposition, was the prime minister when Xi Jinping came. So I don't know how that is going to work out. So it is left to be seen. And they had good relations with the government before. That is to say, the Rowley government before. And the main thing is that the visit yielded results. I won't read those things, but every country benefited. And 10 countries enlisted in Belt and Road. And there are another 10 in Latin America proper. And trade and investment in the Caribbean, two-way trade, increased. In fact, it about quadrupled over a decade. And look at this again. These things must be very worrisome to the United States. Look at this. Am I adding value to something that's happening, or is it real? Now in 2026, Venezuela will be hosting a China-CELAC business meeting with Nicolas Maduro as president. Now that to me is a confrontation opportunity. Because the question is, will Maduro still be president? Will the USA and China be openly contending over Venezuela's present and future? And remember, this is a hemispheric country that China is heavily involved in. And how will Caribbean countries be affected, and how will they navigate? Alicia Barcena, president of CALACS, said this, and I just want to deal with the last line. She says to them, as you seek to do things in your best interest with China, don't forget that you live in the hemisphere with the USA. And when you look at it from the USA's point of view, the China axis with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, the Venezuela axis with the Caribbean, China's growing presence and strength in the hemisphere, it is something to worry about. So it is not just pie in the sky, it is not just people thinking aloud and talking nonsense, it is very real. That book we did on China and the Caribbean, I didn't put up the other book, we did one on Venezuela in 2022. But I want to talk a little bit about this multipolar system. I want to make this point as strongly as I can. China is working with the world as it is. They are taking the world as it is and trying to get the best juice out of it by tweaking, influencing, doing whatever is required, rebalancing, etc. And they are securing themselves with developing countries. They have a strategy. Middle East, Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean. Okay? So, and they are doing all of these things in which the West is unengaged. In other words, they are creating institutions that separate out the West, but bring the developing countries in. President Trump is challenging the world as it is. Right? He is the great disruptor. Why is NATO the way it is? Our friends are taking advantage of the USA. Or adversaries worse. My philosophy is America first. And this is how he does it. At home, and abroad, and in space. In a recent article, he says, I run the country and the world. And the reporter described him as a reflection of a confident, ruthless efficiency with nobody to tell him no. I don't know if anybody could have written it better. In America, the White House is the source of executive power. The Constitution is tested. The legislative branch is tested. The court system is tested. The entire institutional capacity of a democratic country is tested. And in the world, he is really testing that world system. He is asking the question, how much can US presidential power challenge the system and rules of the post-World War order, and what are likely to be the limits of unraveling that World War II order? I think it's very real. So what I'm saying there's a clash of visions between Xi and Trump. And it's not by accident, it's thought out. It's thought out. Trump's is thought out too. He may say ridiculous things and we might laugh at him or we might get angry about him. But I don't think you can say realistically that he is without a cogent thought process in what he's doing strategically. And Xi is very much the strategist. He's very good. But that kind of point of view does certain things. From Trump's point of view, the world up to now was a number one country, the US, and a number two countries addressing a power shift in the global world and in the world order. And China saw itself in this world. Xi Jinping says this. What I have there is what he says. He says most of all they want to get out of the middle income country trap. They don't want to be in a situation where their GDP cannot grow further. They want political and economic stability in China. People forget how multi-ethnic China is as a country. And there is one dominant ethnic group that has been running China for the last significant number of years, as the Han group. And the ethnicity question is a very big question in China, and there are religious dimensions to it as well. And then the Thucydides trap, which is really when a country that is rising to power comes up to meet the really powerful country in the world and begins to feel that it can test that power of the leading country. And Xi always says that he doesn't want to be caught in that trap because he doesn't want to go to war. Because prosperity depends on peace. But for Trump, multipolarity must not mean the decline of the USA and catch up by others. America must always be first in everything that matters. And when the tariff war came, Xi Jinping moved from Thucydides' trap to we will fight to the end. There was a total shift in sensibility and attitude towards the United States and to President Trump. Now they've gone back to the table and it looks like we're going to make some progress, but I mentioned that for its worth, what it's worth. These things have happened since. I talked about the energy province. In any discussion with CARICOM countries, these issues are bound to come up. What about Venezuela, Cuba, immigration, guns? China will inevitably be a factor. So discussion about a 10% tariff is not about a 10% tariff. It is not about tariff at all. I don't think the discussion with China is about tariffs. They have taken the tariffs down to 10% from 145 and 125%. So it is about other things. It is about the state of the new world order. And there are clashing views of what that new order should be. Very clashing. Now, the Caribbean cannot afford the risk of being dependent on one country alone anymore. And it cannot sustain itself on a single revenue earning industry either, whether it is oil or tourism or whatever. It must diversify the economy and its international partners. CARICOM countries generally classified by the World Bank as high income and middle income countries, but they are also caught up in the middle income country trap. They cannot grow. They cannot evolve, right? The USA has proven not to be a good friend to even Canada, Mexico, Europe, and Ukraine. How will it be with the Caribbean? What about the Commonwealth? The UK, surprisingly, the other day, took away visa-free status from Trinidad and Tobago. Just out of the blue. They said criminals from Trinidad, that's to say gangsters, came into the UK and asked for asylum and they were beating the system. Well, it seems to me that that is something you could fix at home. So that is now being negotiated. Europe, what about Europe? Europe has its own problems. Europe, where does Europe? Europe doesn't know where it must go in the world anymore. It is seeking to find its space. And how will Trump's behavior alter the behavior of others? Because if Trump takes a stand like that and gets away with it and he proceeds, it is bound to alter political behavior, governmental behavior, international relations behavior, trade, investment, and development behavior. Everything is going to be affected. So I am saying that we have come through a world in which you had imperialism, you had colonization, right? You had the period of liberalization, you had globalization. You had all of the Washington Consensus telling the world how to organize. And in each of those things, we went along. So now in this thing, as you are seeing the world, because what is happening, people think that the world is closing down. But the world is opening up because of this. All the old arguments and all the new arguments are coming to the fore because of the positioning of Trump in this thing. So, what does reshaping the global order for America first advantage mean? Do developing countries have a say in the global reordering? They never had it before in any of those things, from imperialism to globalization. They never had a say. So are we looking at another marginalization of developing countries? Will the USA do this alone, or will the USA with other big powers determine everything? What about reposition and reshaping of the Western Hemisphere? Does Latin America have a say in the shaping of the hemisphere? Or is that a USA decision? Does the Caribbean have any say at all in the shaping of the region and in the shaping of the hemisphere? I'm sorry to ask those questions. I'm going to posit some solutions. I've raised the problems. I've shown you what the situation is in terms of an evolving hemisphere. But I must raise some of these questions because they're very troubling. Because they are repeat, you see. They are repeat of history. What kind of global paths forwards will developing countries have a say in? How will developing countries guarantee better prospects for the future? How do the fair-minded in the world, wherever they live, articulate the case for a fairer, more compassionate world? In this brutal order, will developing countries be afforded the right to fashion their own future? Or I ask the other question, will they have to seize it? And what form will that take? What happened to the level playing field? When the globalization debate was big, I was a young minister at that time. And when I go to some of these fora and I talked about the playing field is not level, you have to take into account there was an imperial order, there was a colonial order, it took years for independence, something. Playing field is not level. They would tell me with a straight face, forget that, we're starting over. So, what happened to the level playing field? Does not the America First principle assume that the playing field is not level? I want to ask you that. Because he says everybody is taking advantage of the United States of America. Should we not talk now as countries in the world about a level playing field again? What about the Western Hemisphere, the most unequal region in the world, with unequal societies everywhere? In any of those major historical conditions of the world, was the level playing field ever there? What kind of hemispheric order will give the Caribbean a better place and a better opportunity, a better chance? What kind will give Latin America a better chance? I think we have to ask about that, and we have to ask about it bravely. So, are we going to end up in a world being sliced up geographically between the USA, China, and Russia? Remember, they did that at the beginning of the 20th century with Africa, in the imperial order to close up the colonization process in the pre-independence period. Are we going to end up with the USA, China, and Russia with an accepted alignment of countries and domains that compete and cooperate as agreed by the big powers? Is that how it will be again, and how are the rules to be agreed? In what forum? What will be the role of developing countries in it? What leverage will small countries have? How will their interests be advanced or protected? Will it just come down to a petition to a hopefully benevolent king? Or will it be marginalization again? I would like to suggest that the Caribbean do some of these things. When we talk to the United States, as we must over the 10%, we must ask for a comprehensive discussion on those things at the top. We must ask for the support of a prosperity agenda through trade, investment, economic growth, designed as a shared prosperity model. Because the biggest problem in the hemisphere is the inequality within countries and the inequality of countries in the hemisphere. Support a comprehensive program for citizen well-being in the region, which could be comprehensive, properly organized, debated. Support for and respect of the principle of national and regional sovereignty, even for small nations, to maintain the Caribbean as a zone of peace. I was tickled to hear President Trump talk about Syria and say that he had asked the president of Turkey to respect the sovereignty of Syria, because Turkey, of course, has the greatest ambition. It is the country that has benefited most from the movement, the removal of Assad in Syria, and it has huge ambitions for Syria and that part of the world. And he said that Turkey has to be mindful of the sovereignty of Syria. So I think the sovereignty issue is going to be different today than it was 40 years ago to talk about it. But it has to be spoken about. What about support for a sustainable tourism industry, since it is the main source of income for most Caribbean countries? Maybe we should talk about that. Several years ago, I had made the case and it was accepted by a council of tourism ministers and eventually accepted 12 years later by the Association of Caribbean States for a Caribbean sustainable tourism zone. All the countries watched by the Caribbean Sea. But they didn't do it fast enough, and as usual. So I want to mention these things too. I want to mention disaster management collaboration. The Caribbean is a very disaster-prone zone. I think there should be free travel in the hemisphere. There should be very strong laws if you break the law. If you overstay your time, if you work when you're not supposed to, all those things we should deal with. But we should not really hinder the movement of people in the hemisphere. I really do not think so. A strategy for peace and prosperity in the hemisphere that demands mutual engagement with the USA of relevant individual countries. In other words, you can't have pariah countries and then rules for other countries for dealing with the pariahs in order to deal with you. I mean, that is not reasonable, even under conditions of extreme power of a big country. And then freedom to pursue trade, investment, development, relations with all countries, and a roadmap for peace, security, stability, and inclusion for all countries in the hemisphere. The inclusion part is important, and keeping the Americas peaceful is really critical for me. We mustn't allow unreasoned irrationality and marginalization to thrive. I think we have to summon our thoughts and raise our voices and make space for the space that we need. That quote is from a book by V.S. Naipaul called A Bend in the River, written in 1979. The world is as it is. Those who are nothing, who allow themselves to be nothing, have no place in it. So I say that we must not allow ourselves to be nothing. You only end up being nothing if you allow yourself, if you refuse to assert your will. So let us neither surrender our will nor courage. Canada has a role in this, and I want to emphasize this. Canada has a very important role in the hemisphere and the world. Canada is the largest country in the hemisphere, second largest in the world, has amazing resources, very competitive, well-respected, strong relations with the world. I was involved with FOCAL in the 1990s. Ed Dorsman, who was at the University of Toronto, led that. And we did a lot of good things together, and there were other good people in it. But at that time, the strategy for Canada was to reach out to Latin America and the Caribbean and build some intense bonds of relations having to do with trade, investment, and development, but also people-to-people education, a number of things. Now, several Canadian as well as Caribbean thinkers have been arguing the case for a deeper engagement of Canada and the Caribbean with each other, trade, investment, and so on. I think we have to do that. You've made a good start. Your former Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, extended the Caribbean by 10 years and increased the benefits to the Caribbean, and had a very limited number of goods that we could not export to Canada. And that can become a model. So I believe that Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean, not in warlike terms, but in organizational terms, could be involved in some issues that begin to look at the world philosophically first, look at the question of ideology in the context of unequal and unfair societies, and look at the business of how neighbors live in a hemisphere. Now, the Caribbean has many other options. The Caribbean, besides Caribbean, we can strengthen the CBI and get the United States to reduce the 10% tariff to zero. We have opportunities with the European Union, with England by itself now. We have opportunities with China through the Belt and Road, and a small country like Grenada of 100,000 people doesn't need to sell a whole lot of things to get middle class income for a country of 100,000. So it depends on how you see the economics and how you see the strategy. And we could do that, but I think India is a big Commonwealth country, likely to be the fastest growing country over the next decade. You have a bigger Indian diaspora in the Caribbean than Chinese. And it is possible to do things with India that could make a difference in the Caribbean. So we could broaden the effort. And we continue to do things with the United States. Let them do the CBI better than the Canadians have done Caribbean, and give us an opportunity to do something. But I think if we begin to think philosophically about what's happening to the hemisphere, what's happening to the world, what kind of world order we want to create, what is likely to happen, because all of these things are happening so fast and they are happening so dramatically and with such deep consequences, I feel it's important to begin to intervene. What is happening is that we are not intervening intellectually in this debate. What we are doing is that we are answering what the Trump presidency is doing. We are responding to that and saying that that is not right, but we are going by the old order of what is right. We are going by the old notions of democracy. We are going by the old notions of constitutional order and so on. And this testing of the Constitution by Trump is learning from what other authoritarian leaders have done in other countries. What have they done in other countries? The first thing that they do with a big mandate is change the Constitution. Hugo Chavez did that. Maduro did that. Every dictator in the world starts with the Constitution. The Constitution then becomes law. The legislature becomes subjugated to the power of the presidency. And this is what is happening in the world. This is the world order that we are going to. And I think it's a frightening prospect. And if big countries do not stand up because they have too much to lose, little countries are going to have to stand up because they have nothing to lose. Because we cannot allow the world to run on a track like this with derails, because this is what it will end up doing when you take into account these political and economic decisions and geopolitical decisions, and you then take AI into account, in which half of the world's 8 billion people are going to be totally marginalized and dispossessed regardless of where they live in the world. And some of them in developed countries too. So I feel that we've got to take what's happening in the hemisphere as a lesson and see what we can do together. I think there's opportunity for serious intellectual engagement and academic work, research, and thought. And I want to thank you for giving me the courtesy of your attention this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tewarie, for a brilliant and thought-provoking presentation. And in furtherance of this discussion, I'd like to welcome our prolific discussant for this evening, Professor Diego Sanchez Ancochia. Please, I welcome you to the stage. Professor Sanchez Ancochia is Associate Head for the People of Oxford Social Science Division and Professor of the Political Economy of Development at Oxford University. His research aims to identify the best ways to reduce income inequality through the use of social and productive policies, with particular attention to the Latin American experience. In 2020, he published a book called The Costs of Inequality, Lessons and Warnings for the Rest of the World. Together with Juliana Martinez Franzoni, he is the author of The Quest for Universal Social Policy in the South, Actors, Ideas, and Architectures. He is also, Professor Sanchez Ancochia is the co-editor of 4 books and a special issue, and has published papers in international journals such as the Latin American Research Review, the Journal of Latin American Studies, and World Development. He was head of the Oxford Department of International Development between 2019 and 2023, and has collaborated with different international institutions like the World Bank, UNDP, the ILO. Professor Sanchez Ancochia has a BA in economics from the Universidad Complutense, an MA in public administration from the Instituto Ortega y Gasset, and a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research. He loves basketball, both as a player and an NBA fan. He has 2 daughters. One is about to graduate from university, and the other is in the first year of high school. Please join me in welcoming our discussant this evening, Professor Diego Sanchez Ancochia.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Let me start by thanking Professor Tamaka Jones for this kind invitation, and also to Cerlac and CALACS for the opportunity to be here. It's really an honor to be in Canada and to be able to be a discussant of both excellent presentation. So as you saw, I think both a presentation has reflected on the very complex moment that Latin America and the Caribbean is facing. Of course, a moment that is very difficult for the world as a whole. Some of this complexity, particularly regarding the role of Venezuela, which he discussed, is internal to the region. But much of it has to do with the changing in geopolitics and the battle that China and the US are battling at the moment. So what I want to do in the next few minutes, more than discuss, is to complement the description that was presented by asking 2 questions, and by thinking with you on 2 questions. The first is, what are the opportunities and constraints that the current environment creates for Latin America and the Caribbean? And the second is thinking about agency, which was one of the key elements for the lecture today, is how can Latin America respond to the recurrent global environment? Let me start first by describing briefly and complementing the description that was just given, what is the current global environment and how it is characterized by the clash between the US and China. We are clearly witnessing a geopolitical battle that Boy described very well, where the Trump administration is paying a lot of attention to the Western Hemisphere as an area of conflict with China. In fact, as you know, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in his first visit abroad, was actually to Central American and Caribbean countries like the Dominican Republic. So I think it's important we think about this geopolitical battle to think and reflect on what is the strategy and the role of the US and China in the region, to then, as I say, to think about the future of democracy and the future of development. I think, contrary to Boy, I struggle much more to think about what the strategy of Trump in any area, but clearly in the Western Hemisphere at all. But if we want to think about what are some of the components of that potential policy stand, I think it's characterized first by the key role that relationship with Mexico will have, which I think will oscillate all the time between contentious and constructive, and center, of course, on economic integration, migration, and drugs. The second element of the U.S. role in Latin America is the central role of migration and the role of deportations, which are likely to intensify in the future, as you know. The third is trade policy. Well, actually, Latin American countries are in a better position than other parts of the world because they run deficit with Latin America, with the U.S. Excuse me, and because the tariff is only 10% and not the much higher tariffs that are expected for other countries. The fourth element of the role of the US is the particularly close ties with actual populist leaders like Bukele in El Salvador and Milei in Argentina. And the final one, which again I want to echo what Boy was describing, is the actual battle and the attempt to weaken the role of China in Latin America, starting with Panama. So that's the place of the US in the Latin American context. What about China? As you know, China has become a central partner for all Latin American countries. The growth of China cannot be minimized. So trade with China, between China and Latin America, grew from just 0.6% of Latin America's GDP in 2000 to 8.5% in 2021. China is now the first partner for all the South American trade countries. And it's actually, when we discount Mexico, it's actually the share of China in Latin American trade is around 24%. Of course, the role of China, as both discussed, goes beyond trade and centers on investment as well with the Belt and Road Initiative. And in this geopolitical environment dominated by China and the US, relations between Latin America and the two superpowers is, of course, contradictory. Much of the region still considers the US an ally, but at the same time is, of course, worried about the American first and discriminatory policy stand of the Trump administration. China, in many ways, have become a much safer and less uncertain partner for the region, but at the same time, it brings significant challenges because of its huge economic power. So in this geopolitical environment that I have restated and the Boy described so well, I think the interesting questions to answer is what are the future of development and the future of democracy, and how will the US and China affect those two elements. Let me start by the future of development. Latin America and the Caribbean, as many of you know because you work on the region, has actually struggled to catch up with income in developed countries. So in fact, in 2010, the ratio between the GDP per capita in Latin America and that of the richest countries was lower than a century before. 35% in 1910 versus 27% in 2010. And the last 40 years, the region has consistently experienced crisis. As you know, the debt crisis meant that in 1990, Latin America had a lower GDP per capita than in 1980, but the same thing happened between 1998 and 2002, and the same has happened in the last 10 years. We should remember Latin America is now in a particularly difficult economic environment. And why is that? That is, of course, because of primary specialization, particularly in countries south of Panama, and because of the low productivity growth that the region has experienced. According to data from the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean, real labor productivity remained stagnant between 1980 and 2022, and is now lower in Latin America than in the world average. So I think in this difficult context for the region in which growth has become difficult and inequality is pervasive, the Trump administration constitutes a very significant threat. And it constitutes a threat for at least four reasons. The first is that I believe Trump's policies are leading to much more volatility and uncertainty in the global economy, and this could easily relate to a new global recession in the next few years. Secondly, the US protectionism is likely to contribute to a lot of deindustrialization in the region because the 10% tariff, which is not a small tariff, let's not forget that, is likely to affect the manufacturing products that Latin America is exporting, such as textiles and others, much more than, of course, the primary goods like copper or oil. The third way in which the US under Trump constitutes a threat to Latin America has to do with the closing down of US aid programs. According to a study by Wola, that actually evaluated all US aid programs that were either for the whole Latin American region or for specific countries in the region, 84% of all of those programs are being cut. So the aid from the US to the region is moving from 6.67 billion just last year to just 1 billion under Trump. And finally, I think the last element in which the the Trump administration constitute a threat to the region has to do with the likely reduction of remittances and the elimination of migration as one of the solutions for young people in the region. What about China? In many ways, China creates also important challenges for Latin America. In this case, coming from the trade side. Relations between Latin America and China follow a very much a dependentist approach in which is reproducing traditional inequalities. As many of you know, because you might work on China, China exports to Latin America are concentrated on manufacturing products, like machinery and transport equipment, or chemicals. On the other hand, Latin American exports to China are concentrated on primary goods, thus reproducing the type of unequal terms of trade that Prebisch and Singer identified more than 50 years ago. China, in fact, has contributed to the deindustrialization of countries across the region, going from Argentina and Brazil all the way to Chile and Mexico. So I think the current geopolitical environment is likely to create new problems for development in Latin America and the Caribbean. But it also creates some opportunities, and I think it's important to be very clear about those opportunities as well. First, I believe that the conflict between China and the US can actually allow Latin America to make those two countries compete with each other and to try to benefit from higher investment from both of the countries. This will be particularly the case in countries like Brazil, which have the capacity to both, because it's situated with the BRICS, to benefit from investment from China and at the same maintain a relatively positive relationship with with the US. Second, and maybe more contentious in being in Canada, but you need to let me know what you think about it. I actually think that the development of nearshoring and the move to from global to regional global chains is very likely in the US by the US. Despite Trump's initial rhetoric, at the end of the day, I think economic relations between the United States and Mexico and the United States and Central America and the Caribbean may actually intensify and not weaken. This is because, as a former student of mine, Ludovic Arnaud, has shown, American companies and several American states have built close ties of interdependence with Mexico. And they will continue lobbying very intensely to the US administration. And I think at the end, Trump will have and recognize the importance of closer relations with Mexico. And finally, and more importantly, I think there's, and as Party Boys discussed, we are actually under much more political and ideological space for policy innovation than ever before. When Laura and I contributed to a book on the North American trade environment, we actually identify the reduction of policy space as one of the big problems in Latin America for to the promotion of development. However, I actually think that both Trump and China are opening the policy space and debate about what are the potential opportunities. And contrary to what is happening in the 1990s, when the WTO was very influenced, what we are witnessing is much more ability and space to discuss things like industrial policy across the region. So I believe at the end that what we see in development is both opportunities and threats for Latin America, which also coincide with some of the opportunities as threat for the Caribbean that Boy was discussing. Unfortunately, however, the future of democracy is much bleaker. The world is experiencing a democratic backsliding across the world. According to IDEA's Global State of Democracy report in 2024, nearly half of the 173 countries studied are experiencing an erosion of democracy in the last year. This is, of course, a significant problem for Latin America. According to the Economic Intelligence Unit, only 2 countries in Latin America, Costa Rica and Uruguay, are considered full democracies. Moreover, almost 3/4 of all Latin American citizens believe that the political system benefits just a few. This is, of course, totally linked to the problem of high concentration of income and wealth in the region. I always give this data because I think it's actually demonstrating of what are some of the deepest problems with democracy. Just 1% of Latin Americans, the top 1%, receive almost 5 times more than the bottom 50% in Peru, 4 times more than the 50% poorest in Mexico, and 3.5 times more than in Chile, more than any other country in the world. As a result, dissatisfaction with democracy in Latin America is rampant, and support for populist leaders who promise easy solutions very significant. Boe discussed the case of Venezuela, which in many cases shares similarities with Nicaragua. Here, what we see is unpopular leaders who have used their growing control on institutions to consolidate their power and to consolidate authoritarian regimes. But I find the case of El Salvador much more interesting in what we are seeing in the region in terms of the weakening of democracy. What the Bukele administration has done is weaken consistently the separation of power, push for unconstitutional reforms, and decrease transparency. But more significantly, what we see is actually a continuous attack on human rights through the war on gangs, which at the same time is extremely popular. So what we see is Bukele, despite all his move towards an authoritarian regime, being one of the most popular leaders in the region. And I think this shows that the move and the weakening of democracy is a weakening also of the values of democracy across the Latin American population. So in this context, what is likely to be the impact of China and Trump? I think actually very negative. So Trump's re-election constitutes a big threat to democracy across the region for at least 4 reasons. The first is a demonstration effect. Don't need to tell you what the last 5 months have represented for the rule of law in the US. We see deportations without due process, continuous attack on the judiciary and the free press, illegal firings of public servants, unjustified pardons, and the list goes on and on and on and on. But there's little doubt that leaders in other countries in the Western Hemisphere, at least in Latin America, are taking note and are thinking, if this is what Trump does, why shouldn't I be able to do the same thing? The second threat that Trump constitutes for the democracy in the region has to do with the elimination of pro-democracy foreign aid. The dismantling of US aid constitutes not just a problem for development, but also a problem for democracy. It is going to weaken the critical press much across the region and non-profit organizations. And this is very evident in particular in the case of Central America. The third reason why I think Trump will is weakening democracy in Latin America is because of its policy towards migration. The rights of the anti-migration agenda in Latin America, in the US, will have negative implications all across the region and will weaken the rights of migrants in places like Mexico or Central America. And of course, deportees are today being mistreated in El Salvador, and we could see the same policies in other countries like Ecuador. Finally, Trump constitutes a threat to democracy in Latin America because of its support to authoritarian leaders and authoritarian behaviors. Again, here, Bukele and the close links between Bukele and Trump are probably the best representation of this negative trend, but it's not the only one. There's very little doubt in my mind that Trump will build very close links to Novoa in Ecuador and support its Mano Duro policies, as well as the populist policies of Milei in Argentina. I told you when discussing development that China and the US could compete with each other and that could have a positive effect on the region. Unfortunately, this is not what is happening in terms of democracy. What we see is that China also constitutes a threat for democracy in Latin America. China is actually becoming a role model of what is a strong state and a role model on what is the possibility of trying to build a pro-development but anti-democracy policies in the region. The close relations that China maintains with Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba show the undermining of democratic institutions in the region, but this is happening in other parts of the region as well. So I'm afraid that I want to claim that the future of democracy in the region is bleak and that we should be particularly worried about it, although I look forward to your own reactions and views on this. So in this context of difficulties and of Trump and China becoming threats and some opportunities for the region, what is that Latin America can do? How can they exert the agency that the region has? We concluded with a set of recommendations for the Caribbean and a great sentence. I quote, "The world is as it is. Those who are nothing, who allow themselves to be nothing, have no place in it." I want to complement the set of policies that he recommended for the Caribbean with two key policies for Latin America. I think this is a moment in which industrial policy needs to play a much consistent role across Latin America, and which I said before, there's actually more policy space than in the last 40 years to discuss industrial policy. That industrial policy needs to focus on adding value to activities that are already taking place in the region. For example, moving from lithium to batteries in the case of Chile or Bolivia. This is a policy that should not just focus on manufacturing activities, but should actually think about how to add value in services and the agricultural sector. Is a sectoral policy which has to identify new activities to move up in the value chain from, for example, tourism, as it was discussed, to things like how to add value in apparel or in the electronics in some countries in the region. I think it's an industrial policy which needs to look for much more processes of regional integration in the Caribbean, but also between Latin American countries, for example, between Mexico and Central America. Industrial policy in Latin America should actually follow two motors, as I always say. On the one hand, Latin America has to try to move up the value chain to be closer to the global technological frontier, but at the same time, it has to support low productivity sectors and support small and medium firms in a consistent fashion. So that's on the way to promote economic growth at a time, as I say, where there's much more policy space to do that than before. But of course, the other big challenge in Latin America has to do with high levels of inequality, which attack and harm the political equality and democratic institutions as well. So, what is that can be done in this area? I think Latin America is now in a position to try to combine both trade distribution policies and redistribution policies. The list of policies and interventions in income distribution should include ways to improve the distribution of wealth and human capital by investing more and better in education. And Boys knows very well some of the ways of doing that in tertiary education. And this to be done by introducing new taxes on wealth and property. Second, we need to look ways in the region to strengthen trade unions, but also social movements that represent the interests and rights of informal workers. Third, the better regulation of financial markets, so they contribute to actually the real economy instead to just creating gains for banks and hedge funds. And finally, we need a new set of social policies that center on universal healthcare and pensions across the region. Of course, when I was thinking about these policies, both in terms of in redistribution and in terms of industrial policy, I thought a little bit that this is like thinking about the magic world in a region like Latin America, because this will not happen unless we have new social pacts and new and progressive strengthening of institutions across the region. And here I'm afraid I have to leave you with more questions than answers. Because what we need to think about researchers is in this difficult environment that both Boy and I have described, how can we make states policies much more effective? How can we strengthen institutions? How can we empower social movements and empower pro-democratic actors in the region? And how and which ones are going to be key regional actors that actually will promote a more developmental and democratic agenda in the future. And let me say that here I think the role of Brazil should not be minimized. I believe that Brazil, particularly under Lula, has a huge responsibility to play across the region, and and that actually the region will have a serious discussion of democracy on democracy only if it's led in many ways by the Lula administration in Brazil. Let me conclude with a call to all of us as researchers. I believe that we are in a moment in which much must be thought and much must be discussed in conferences like this one. In this very difficult environment, precisely because of this very difficult environment, we as academics must work not just in developing new theories, but on thinking about the link between those theories and the new policy recommendations. We need to think very creatively about how, in this very complex geopolitical environment, Latin America develops new ideas and developing new policies to promote systematic links, as Laura said, between the global, the national, and the local, and systematic links between democracy and development. This is a challenge, but it's a challenge that we must meet if we want to make sure that Latin America has its agency beyond depending on the US and the Trump administration and China. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sanchez and Cochia, for providing us with that exceptional response. What you have done, before we move on, can we have another round of applause for this? And we have heard their arguments this evening. So what we'd like to do moving forward is open the door for you to provide your responses or ask your questions in response to what you've heard. So we have a mic that's available for you. Once you raise your hand, we're happy to bring it to you so you can ask your question or give a response to what you've heard.
Thank you to both of you professors. It was amazing sitting here and listening to you guys. And you guys are both obviously accomplished professors and people in their own right. I just had a quick question. Like, I've always written a lot of my papers on China and China's involvement in the rest of the world. I was wondering, you kind of touched upon it. What do you think? Like, is this involvement from China? Like, we saw the benefits that China has in in its involvement in the Caribbean. Going forward, is this more detrimental to the Caribbeans or is it more beneficial to the Caribbean with, taking into account the US's involvement and their interest within that hemisphere?
Yeah. I think you've captured the dilemma well, which is that there are obviously benefits, but there are dangers. And I think the benefits are easy to discern, which is to say you can have investment, you can have increased exports. I'm talking from the Latin American or Caribbean countries' point of view. If you export more, you have more investment. Let's say you have more Chinese tourists. Let's say you upgrade your technology, you move up your value chain. You have better integrated technological systems. Those things can be really beneficial. The danger is that, China wants as much resources as it can, and it will take those and negotiate for them. Secondly, although the Caribbean has a lot of experience dealing with big countries, the Caribbean has always dealt with USA, Canada, Europe, England. The experience of dealing with those countries have not been very good, which is to say that you get benefits, but you lose a lot in the system. And I think that difficulty will intensify with a country like China, that you could get some benefits, but what you lose is quite large. What we also see too is that China is using the world system, I find, in a very significant way, which is that it is multiplying its diasporas in every country that it invests in. It is then establishing retail trades, construction trades, and others that can compete with those that already exist in the country. And thirdly, what it then does is that it creates a catchment operational market for import of Chinese goods. And that raises the whole question of the balance of trade situation. So I think it's a mixed blessing, and it has to be thoughtfully addressed along with a strategy for diversifying your economic engagement with other countries beyond China. I think the Caribbean needs to trade as much with as many people as possible. And the one thing I forgot to mention as I was speaking is that an important strategy for the Caribbean is what I would call a neighborhood strategy, in which it strengthens and deepens its relations with other CARICOM and Caribbean countries, but it also strengthens and deepens its relations with the Central American countries, with whom it should really have a free trade association, because they are comparable in terms of evolution and development. And all those coastal countries on the periphery of the Caribbean Sea, the Caribbean can do that. And as I said, how much do you need to sell to how many countries to manage 100,000 people, or 500,000 people, or 1 million people, or in the case of Jamaica, 2.5 million people? And I think that a much more strategic approach could protect you as well as advance you. But it has to be done with thought. I don't think you can leave the thought out of the equation that is emerging in this world.
Let me just a couple of things to complement, because I totally agree. I think there's currently a threat and opportunity from China that we shouldn't minimize. The threat has to do with trade diversion. All the products that China cannot export to the US because they are too expensive are going to go somewhere else in the world. And I'm afraid that Latin American countries will be one of the regions in which we might see an increase in the export of things like apparel to the region, and I think that's a big challenge. I think the opportunity comes from sustainable development. China is becoming the main technological innovator in green technologies, and actually if it's willing to not just export some of those products, but lead to technological transfer, I think the region will be benefit and will make a big jump in green technologies than ever before. And I do hope that, as we were saying, the region is able to strategically partner with China in the agenda of green technology.
Thank you, professors. We have time for 2 more questions. Oh, we have 2 hands, and we have time for 2 more questions.
Just briefly, you mentioned that there's an oil boom in the works. There's an oil boom in the works in the Caribbean. Guyana, they found lots of oil, and now all the countries are about to do it. Brazil is about to start exploration in the Amazon, the Guyana, Suriname, and so on. So they are doing oil thing. Are there any plans to set up sovereign wealth funds to go the Norwegian way instead of the Alberta, Venezuela, and all the other ways of spending the money as it comes?
Well, I know in the case of Guyana, they have established a fund. I don't know about the other countries, and it's not so much an oil boom as an oil potential. You have exploration in Guyana. They have not yet started to exploit natural gas, but that is an opportunity. In Suriname, it's the same thing. They've started with oil and natural gas. Grenada, you have potential for natural gas. Barbados, I think, has oil, but I think out of environmental considerations and concern for the tourism, they have been hesitant about going through with it. But I think the countries have learned from the mistakes of other countries, including Trinidad and Tobago, in which we did a sovereign wealth fund very late, and it remained very small. I think they have learned that if you're going to do this thing, you've got to take the decision very early and do it well.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed listening to both of you, especially from a sociological perspective, which is not my field, economic development, international trade. I do quality of life and human rights, and in 2 weeks I will talk about my work in University, Manchester College, and Oxford. What I understand, the world is prevalent with inequality, disparity, human rights violation. With all these, unfortunately, stupidities going on around the world and disparities, human rights violation, what is the hope for Caribbean countries with such leadership in the world and leadership in the region, which the focus is rather economic development and not human-centered prosperity and development? China is dealing with a lot of human rights violations. Trump the same way, and many leaders in Caribbean, I think they deal with the same thing. What's the human rights policy here in this formula you are presenting?
Well, should I focus on the issues you raised about what hope, or should I focus on the issues of human rights?
Human rights, respect in economic development.
Yeah, well, I think
migration is one of them.
Huh?
You mentioned that 1/3 of Venezuelans is the same or a little bit more, less than Syrians. They have been out
Yeah.
of the country. And I think many more millions they are on their way to go to West just because of the poverty disparity and world stability which is going on. It's not only the people in the region,
Yes.
it's all around the globe.
I agree. The well, the Caribbean is lucky because most of the Caribbean does not have. You might have bad governments, but you don't have governments that are so bad and so severe that you have extreme human rights violations in the Caribbean. I think we've been lucky, we've been spared. So that is a good thing. But the triggers to migration are economic opportunity, which they might feel stifled about or they might feel hopeless about. And the other thing is political exclusion, which sometimes comes with lack of economic opportunity. And when those things are triggered, people look for better fortunes elsewhere. I think I think this is true of not just the Caribbean, but all of Latin America, and I think Diego will agree with me. Unless we can solve the problem of better governance, stronger institutions, economic strategies that basically create what you might call shared prosperity. And unless you can deal with some of the structural problems in these societies, whether it is land ownership, whether it is the structure of the system of wealth accumulation, etc., I think these problems are going to persist, and people are going to, once they don't have opportunities, they're going to want to go elsewhere. But my own feeling is the solution is really good government and good governance and good economic policies that look at shared prosperity as a desirable model. And there are many ways of doing that. You could start with the country you have and say, well, this is what we are going to do. And you can also look at the country you desire and say, this is what we need to do in order to get there. And you bring the people into the process so that they understand, so that you can do it. Now, in some Latin American countries, they might be too big to do this well. But in the Caribbean, it is possible to do this in every country. And really, the scourge of the Caribbean since independence has really been bad governance and horrible economic policies that do not take into account the fact that you really need to have shared prosperity. You need to have raised the standard of living of all the population as we move forward. And you've got to give people an inclusive opportunity to govern themselves, even though you have political parties which change from election to election. And I think we've missed the boat on that, I'll be quite frank with you.
So let me refer to Latin America, obviously, and ask the question on Latin America. My problem is I'm pessimistic by heart, and this is a good moment to be pessimistic. But let me say I think four key reasons for hope. The first is the role of social movements in the region, right? From the landless movement in Brazil, which is, let's remember, one of the largest in the world, all the way to the role of the progressive Catholic Church. We have a huge actor for democracy and for human rights that is not so present in other parts of the world. Second, I think the role of ideas. Latin America is a source of very significant ideas that go from structuralism to human rights and law agenda. That's important. Third, the region has become a source of policy innovations, from conditional cash transfers with all its problems as being important, to doing some industrial policies in creative ways. And fourth, I wonder whether we will see an anti-Trump reaction similar to what we have seen in this country, in other parts of the region, and that actually will strengthen political parties of a progressive nature in places like Brazil, for example.
So Dr. Tewarie, Dr. Sanchez, okay, excellent presentation. My name is Reshaping. I'm from York University. I'm a research associate here at Cerlac. I have two very quick questions. One, in respect to Caribbean and Latin American strategy around their diaspora. So the diasporas across the world, we're talking about how China is utilizing its diaspora. How can we utilize our diaspora in developed countries and other parts of the world, developing countries? And to also add to that, to layer to it, what would be a strategy towards cooperation of the diasporas within those developed countries or other countries with more resources to put on certain events where we come into contact, where at home, we would just not necessarily think of, oh, I have a neighbor who is Latin American, just a couple 100 kilometers that direction, right? And then just a regional response to cooperation with authoritarianism. For example, it may be hard for Latin American and Caribbean countries to directly criticize the administration's deportation to El Salvador, but El Salvador holding these individuals, I guess without charges, right? That may not necessarily be too hard of a thing to comment on. So what role is there for solidarity in combating authoritarianism?
If I might attempt to answer. If on the first question with the diaspora, I can think of three things that could be valuable. One is trade. The other one is investment. And there are complexities, but we can talk about that. And the third would be remittances. And the fourth would be the creation of opportunities, as you suggest, where you create the conditions in which people can come together and continue a dialogue in order to make some of those things possible. But I believe that the diasporas can be used more strategically, and I think also the diaspora can use their leverage in a much better way. Bear in mind though, that no country wants people to be living in their country as residents and citizens and always living with their mind somewhere else. So, I mean, you have to contribute in the society where you live, but you can also find ways of enhancing the value of your presence in your society as well as the society from which you came in the ways I mentioned, like trade, investment, and so on. And I think those are possible. On the issue of authoritarianism, that Bukele thing is very difficult because people in Guatemala are very happy that all the criminals are in prison, and they don't.
El Salvador.
El Salvador, sorry. And they really don't care that some innocent people might have been locked up because they now have peace, they have freedom, and they don't have to worry as much about things they used to worry about. But on the other hand, I mean, in the long run for these same people, they are going to find little by little that authoritarianism doesn't self-limit. You know, it doesn't target so-called criminal elements today or real criminals today and not worry about the fallout and limit authoritarian behavior to that. And everybody who is happy today will not always constitute a fully happy people going forward forever. The nature of democracy is dissent. All right, dissent is what makes democracy valuable, that you can say something different. And once dissent starts, authoritarianism is likely to spread. And that is the real danger in countries like that. And that's why I agree with Diego that it's a real problem. Because when you have people in the center of Washington doing things that threaten democratic systems and are bad examples to the rest of the world, and you have an endorsement of Bukele in that way, and other leaders in that way, I mean, it can have unpredictable effects in unpredictable ways. And it's a problem. But Diego may want to say something about it.
So in terms of where's the possibilities for solidarity, I again emphasize, as I did in the presentation, the key role for me of Brazil and the Lula administration. So I think the region will advance as much as the Lula administration is willing to be critical of some of these elements. And the problem for the region is that unfortunately it actually maintained a very weak response to Venezuela and to the Venezuelan element. So I do think that part of the region has lost its own democratic credibility by the reaction to the Venezuelan case. But it has a new opportunity now, and I hope that leadership is actually more active than it has been until now.
Maybe take one final question from the back.
But I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Tamika Samuel Joseph, who and Dr. Maria for their dynamic, progressive, and visionary leadership of the center in blending the two fields together, because the center has a role to play, providing intellectual illumination and policy guidance to the whole region. So please join us this session. Sure, please join me in congratulating.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. And I know there are other members of the audience with comments and questions. Please be reminded that there is a reception afterward where you may speak with the professors while they eat and drink. But at this time, I'd like to hand over to my fellow co-director, Professor Maria Constanza Guzman,
and she will be taking us out to the end of our session. Thank you.
Buenas noches, bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Welcome everybody. I definitely don't want to keep you from your wine and from the animated conversations that I'm sure you are about to have in 1 minute. I just have a few thanks and a few invitations for you. The first thank you is a very, very special thanks to Professor Tewarie and Professor Sanchez and Cochea for being here today and for giving us some direction in these very bleak times, as you have pointed out. I also want to thank Professor Miguel Gonzalez and my dear, dear co-director, Professor Tamika Samos-Jones, for putting together this extraordinary panel. And I want to thank CALACS very especially for entrusting us with the conference this year. And very special thanks to Laura for highlighting this long-standing relationship, which we hope and trust this conference will strengthen and project into the future. I want to thank our local organizing committee for their amazing work, for making this possible. Luisa, Lua, Camila, all the volunteers for doing this incredible work. So on behalf of all of Cerlac members and of us, a warm welcome to all of you. From many of you coming from afar. I also want to remember those that were not able to join us in this very rich intellectual space, which, because we are not able to move freely, as Professor Tewarie was pointing out. A lot of people applied, wanted to join us, and were not able to get their visas or were too afraid. Many people were too afraid in the States, were too afraid to come and have their visas rescinded and so on. So I want for all of us to keep them in our thoughts. As for invitations, I want to invite you very specially to the Distinguished Fellow Award ceremony on Saturday for Professor Alan Simmons, followed by a lunch. I want to invite you to visit. Oh, okay. There's another reminder that I was not able to read, so I'm gonna let Tommy mention that in a minute. I want to invite you to Cerlac. We're right here. Our center is here on Canis Tower on the 8th floor. You absolutely have to visit us and get to see a little bit of the space so that you can also welcome colleagues and students, graduate students. It's a great opportunity for conversations from scholars from around the world. We have visiting scholars regularly at Cerlac. And we want to highlight the program has incredible roundtables, film screenings, workshops, book launches, so definitely enjoy every minute of it, and then also enjoy the spring, which has finally arrived in Toronto. It's amazing, beautiful streets, beautiful flowers, amazing tulips, and a very nice exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario called Recuerdo, recently opened, so if you like art photography in Latin America, that has the perfect combination. Thank you so much, and please enjoy the reception.